special thank you to my patrons for both helping make this video happen and providing today's topic. The history of college football has always been a story of haves and have-nots. From the tradition-rich and experienced Ivies that dominated the earliest eras of the sport, to the countless arms races over stadiums, facilities, media rights, slush funds, NIL funds, there has always been the haves and the have-nots. From this position of inequality comes envy, comes aloofness, and either through conference affiliation or regional proximity, or through plain historical happenstance, so too comes rivalries. Indeed, some of the most lopsided rivalries in college football and in organized American sports. What are some of these rivalries? How do they form? And what is college football's most lopsided rivalry? Before we jump into the rivalries, though, we have a couple big questions to answer. What constitutes a rivalry, and what constitutes a lopsided rivalry? Rivalry is a very loose term in the realm of college football. I could sit here and call, for instance, Alabama and Troy rivals, but I doubt any Alabama or Troy fan would agree. For a rivalry to exist, it needs at least some consensus on both sides that the game means something more than a normal matchup. A consensus that's difficult to gauge nationwide. All to say, I defer to Wikipedia. If a page exists for a rivalry game, a page presumably created and maintained by fans of one or both programs involved in the supposed rivalry, it counts in my book. The second question is just as subjective, as the definition of lopsided doesn't exactly involve a percentage. So for this video, a, quote, lopsided rivalry is one where the winning program has a 70% or higher winning percentage over the losing program. Lastly, we're primarily sticking to the Power 4 plus Pac-2, though Power 4 versus Group of 6, I guess, rivalries are also included. With parameters set, meet college football's most lopsided rivalries. We begin in the bottom right corner with the longest rivalry of the sample, Tennessee versus Kentucky. Claiming the title of second oldest rivalry in the SEC and fourth most played, Tennessee-Kentucky is your archetypal lopsided conference rivalry. Beginning fairly evenly matched, even at times favoring the Wildcats, from Robert Neyland's tenure onwards, Tennessee would gain a dominant lead in the series they'd never relinquish, amassing as much as 26 consecutive wins from 1985 to 2010. While the series hasn't always been competitive on the field, both teams have found ways to make it competitive outside the field of play, especially in regards to this thing. This is the barrel, brought in as a rivalry's trophy in 1925, inspired by both the region's penchant for rubbing alcohol-adjacent liquor and Michigan and Minnesota's own little brown jug, which, by the way, appears right here on the graph. From 1925 to 1997, it would be awarded to the winner of each matchup, unless, of course, it was simply stolen back by the other institution, with Smokey, on at least one occasion, getting caught in the crossfire and stolen as well. Even Vanderbilt would occasionally get in on the fun, once stealing it for their in-state rival shortly before a basketball game against Kentucky, a game they'd go on to lose. The barrel would last be used as a trophy in 1997, with Tennessee taking it home for the 12th consecutive year when tragedy struck Lexington. A car crash, allegedly involving alcohol, would take the lives of 2 Kentucky players alongside one of their friends. Since then, the beer barrel has been discontinued, and its whereabouts are currently unknown, with its most recent appearance coming in 2019 alongside Tennessee's former tight ends coach. When reading the graph left to right, there's a rough descending trend line, with the exception of this group down here, headlined by these 3 nearly identical rivalries, all hailing from the ACC. The first is Miami-Louisville, with Miami holding a .735 winning percentage across 17 games. The rivalry is, for the most part, the brainchild of the ACC itself, with both programs playing sporadically before Louisville's entrance to the ACC in 2014, with Miami going 9-2-1 across their non-conference matchups. The two play for the Schnellenberger Trophy, named for Howard Schnellenberger, legendary Hurricane and Cardinal head coach, and the only connecting thread these two universities have, and thus the only reason this was ever conceived as a rivalry. The second of this three-series cluster involves another Floridian school, Florida State, Virginia. The Seminoles hold a .737 winning percentage across 19 games in the Jefferson Epps series, named for the University of Virginia's founder, Thomas Jefferson, and his grandson, Francis W. Epps, two-time mayor of Tallahassee and the man responsible for the construction of what would eventually become Florida State. Despite the name of the rivalry having its roots in the 19th century, the origin of the rivalry itself is a lot more recent, dating back to a 1995 game between the Cavaliers and Seminoles. Going into the game a perfect 29-0 in ACC play, Florida State would take their first ever conference loss to Virginia. The game would be played annually from 1992 to 2006, with Florida State holding a dominant 13-2 advantage before the rivalry stopped being played annually. The final ACC rivalry of this bunch would be a cross-conference series, one with far more stakes than any other rivalry on this graph. The Alabama-Clemson rivalry is, first and foremost, the playoff rivalry between Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney. The two most dominant programs of the 2010s, the Tigers and Crimson Tide, would split their 4 playoff matchups, with the winner of each being crowned that year's national champion, either after the game or in the following national championship. What's not really discussed in this rivalry are the 15 games these programs would play before the playoff era. The two would play very sporadically from 1900 to 2008, with Clemson winning the first 3 games of the series before dropping 13 in a row to Alabama, giving the Tide a .737 winning percentage in the overall series. Right below the ACC cluster is one of the sample's largest outliers, both in its relative place among the sample and the nature of the rivalry itself. Back in the day, the Oregon Webfoots, today the Oregon Ducks, played a Thanksgiving Day rivalry game in San Francisco against the St. Mary's Gales, named the Governor's Trophy game after the rivalry's trophy, the Governor's Perpetual Trophy. Beginning play in 1929 and ending play in 1950, due to the Gales discontinuing football, St. Mary's would, funnily enough, dominate Oregon throughout this rivalry, going 7-3 across the 10-game series and keeping the Ducks out of the Rose Bowl in 1929. Of the 42 rivalry games here, 13 are in-state rivalries. Among them are LSU Tulane, Colorado State, Boston College UMass, Utah State, and of course, Bedlam. Starting play in 1904 with a resounding 74-0 Sooner victory, Oklahoma State would entrench itself in the coming decades as one of college football's oldest and most recognizable one-sided rivalries, with Oklahoma holding a .801 winning percentage across the 118-game series, including 3 separate 10-plus game unbeaten streaks. It's a rivalry that, unfortunately, was put on hold for the foreseeable future due to Oklahoma's departure from the Big 12, ending in poetic fashion with a narrow Oklahoma State victory. The series is over, in football at least. In wrestling, the sport where the term Bedlam was actually first used, the game will remain an annual conference matchup since the SEC does not sponsor wrestling. One Oklahoma State has ironically dominated since its beginning in 1925, holding a .831 winning percentage over the Sooners. Curiously, Bedlam is not the only rivalry on this graph, with drastic swings of dominance across the wide spectrum of intercollegiate athletics. Florida-Kentucky is among the SEC's most lopsided football rivalries, with the Gators winning as much as 31 straight from 1987 to 2017, the 5th largest winning streak over a single opponent in Division I college football history, and the longest such streak in SEC history. The relationship is naturally flipped on the hardwood, with the Blue Blood Wildcats holding a decisive .724 winning percentage over Florida. Yet in the case of both the football and basketball rivalries, it's become significantly more competitive in recent years. Since we've discussed the rivalry with the 5th most wins over a single opponent, we might as well round out the top 3, all of which appear right here on this graph. And number 3 is a rivalry I've actually covered in a previous video, college football's very first rivalry, Princeton-Rutgers. Beginning in 1869, the Princeton Tigers, one of early college football's premier programs, would notch 33 straight wins against the Cross-State Scarlet Knights from 1869 to 1937. 33 games that account for a whole 46.5% of the entire series, and 62.3% of Princeton's all-time wins over Rutgers. After the streak, the rivalry would slowly get more and more competitive before, in its final years, favoring Rutgers as they began their ascent to major college football, while Princeton and the other Ivies dropped down to Division I AA. The final game of college football's first rivalry would be played in 1980, with Rutgers winning 44-13. Number 2 is another lopsided former Big 12 matchup between the Nebraska Cornhuskers and Kansas Jayhawks. Winning 36 straight from 1969 to 2004, this streak, alongside a separate 27-game unbeaten streak from 1917 to 1943, would give Nebraska a .791 winning percentage over their southern rivals. That being said, Kansas would occasionally find moments to get their licks in, like in 2007, where Kansas not only blew out the Cornhuskers, but did so scoring 76 points, the most points either team would ever score in the series. Like Bedlam, the game would be discontinued when Nebraska left the Big 12, ending in 2010 as the longest uninterrupted rivalry in college football history. Then at number 1 is Notre Dame Navy. Beginning play in 1927, the two longtime Eastern independents would first meet on fairly equal footing. Yet as Navy declined across the 20th century, Notre Dame would take an insurmountable lead in the series, claiming a .858 winning percentage against the Midshipmen. Accounting for over half of Notre Dame's 81 wins over Navy is a 43-game winning streak for the Irish from 1964 to 2007. It's an almost unseen level of futility, which raises an obvious question. Why? For most of these rivalries, conference affiliation, regional proximity, or both keep the series alive, no matter how lopsided the rivalry gets. Notre Dame Navy has none of these traits, and yet it's played every single year. How come? Well, the answer goes back to World War II, where the University of Notre Dame faced a near-fatal financial crisis. There weren't enough students to keep the school operating, and in desperation, Notre Dame reached out to Navy, offering their facilities in return for much-needed funds. The Navy would accept, repurposing South Bend's facilities for V-12 training, and keeping the University of Notre Dame alive. As a sign of gratitude, the Irish would offer to play the Naval Academy every year, an offer that's been renewed every decade since. When zooming out and looking at the entire graph, you might have noticed these two little dots all the way up at the 1,000 mark. They're not mistakes. These are the only two rivalries I've found that claim a 100% winning percentage for the winning program. And both are just as ridiculous as their placement here makes them out to be. The first is the Confusion Bowl, a series played a whole 4 times between Miami, Florida, and Miami of Ohio, being named after two entirely separate regions of the United States, named after two entirely separate native tribes. The rivalry between the two Miamis would begin with Miami, Florida's founding in 1928, with Miami of Ohio's president at the time, Alfred Upham, sending a heated letter to the university in Coral Gables, demanding the school drop the Miami name on, quote, moral grounds, a request that obviously fell on deaf ears. The two would eventually settle the dispute on the football field in 1945, with the Atlanta Journal first coining the name Confusion Bowl in a 27-13 Hurricane victory. The two would play each other 3 more times in 1946, 1987, and 2023, with Miami, shockingly, winning every single matchup. The second rivalry in the 1000 Club is college football's most one-sided in-state rivalry. West Virginia-Marshall, the so-called Friends of Coal Bowl, would begin in the early 20th century, playing 4 games from 1911 to 1923, when the game was put on a permanent hiatus as Marshall was relegated to the lower divisions of college football. The series would make a return 74 years later, the same year Marshall was promoted to Division 1A. The Thundering Herd, fresh off an undefeated FCS National Championship run in '96, would open the 1997 season in Morgantown, and despite an electric performance from Marshall's Chad Pennington and Randy Moss, West Virginia would notch their 5th straight win over the Herd. Scheduling disagreements would put the series yet again in stasis for the rest of the 90s and much of the 2000s. That is, until the two universities eventually hammered out an agreement to resume play in 2006, with the help of West Virginia's governor at the time, Joe Manchin. The 2006 matchup would officially begin the Friends of Coal Bowl, sponsored by the Friends of Coal nonprofit trade group, and in all 7 games of the renewed series, West Virginia would come out on top. One game would end in overtime, another game would end early after a 4-hour weather delay, but most would end in a Mountaineer blowout. The last game to be played by the two West Virginian teams would come in 2012, with the short-lived series coming to an end when West Virginia joined the Big 12, and as of 2025 it seems unlikely to return anytime soon. So, we return to our original question. What is college football's most lopsided rivalry? Well, I have a few answers. If you're going by purely winning percentage, it's the Friends of Coal Bowl. If you favor longevity, it's probably either Bedlam or Notre Dame Navy. But there's another, all by itself in no man's land. It's an in-conference rivalry between two Power 4 teams, played 48 times across 107 years, and it is my personal pick for the most lopsided college football rivalry of all time. This right here is Penn State, Maryland. Playing their first game in 1917, the two would begin regular play in 1960, and shortly after, in 61, Maryland would notch their first win over the Nittany Lions 21-17. It would take until 2014 for them to notch their next. Mind you, this was a game played nearly annually from 1960 to 1993, and the most the Terps could offer in that time span was a tie in 1989. To make matters worse, Maryland would consistently take these games down to the wire, with more than a third of Penn State's 29-game unbeaten streak consisting of single-score wins. Single-score wins Maryland just could not find a way to win. The series would be put on hold in 1994 as officials from both universities tried, and failed, to keep the series going after Penn State's admission into the Big Ten. The ceasefire would last for 21 years, finally resuming play when Maryland joined the Big Ten in 2014. Despite the hiatus, the chippiness remained, with a brawl breaking out in the middle of Maryland's second ever win over Penn State. Since then, the two programs have faced off annually, with shots at one another becoming somewhat frequent. James Franklin, in particular, has gotten a number of jabs in, both taking care to belittle both Maryland and the supposed rivalry they share, while simultaneously engaging in Pennsylvanian revanchism. As of 2025, Maryland has 3 wins to Penn State's 44, which combined with the rivalry's only tie in 1989, to give the Nittany Lions a .927 winning percentage over the Terrapins. All of this to say, the next time you find your team losing 4 straight to a rival, don't worry. It could always be worse. I'd like to, again, thank my patrons. Captain Coey, the King of War 541, William L. Jagnow, Aiden Wong, Yeah Avenue, Ryan Liu, Authentic Sims, Max Kern, Joe Sports 2022, Lance Justice, Class Jackson Lawsuit, Hopper, October Rusto 2, Justin Pedraza, Cole, Nick Knudsen, Lurker, Trash Can Gus, Ease.L, Spicy Babe, The Erupturatan, Adrian Genge, Deatheros, Sean McWilliams, CC, The Hidden Source, Bradley Moore, at Signwood, Scarface1, Mega Doomer, Philip, and Crosley Jones. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see y'all in the next video.